You think you're honest because you speak with clarity, because you tell the truth. But do you tell the whole truth, or only a selected, polished version of it? Do you tell the full truth, or a fluid form of that truth, shaped to protect the self you think you need to be? Do you reveal what actually matters, or only what won't threaten your image? Do you speak from your center, or from the mask you've trained to sound authentic? Because most people don't lie to deceive. They lie to preserve the version of themselves that helped them survive. They lie to feel consistent. They lie to keep the architecture of identity intact, even when that identity has already expired. And the smarter you are, the more refined the lie. Not because you're manipulative, but because your psyche is loyal to the last version of you it believes can hold coherence. Even after awakening, even after self-work, the ego doesn't surrender. It adapts. It no longer says, "I'm fine." It says, "I've healed." It says, "I've integrated." And just like that, it protects the mask using the language of awakening. That's why this video isn't about self-awareness. It's about individuation, what Carl Jung called the process of becoming whole, not just informed. It's built through shadow work, not surface growth. Not better, not more spiritual, whole. And that path doesn't reward articulation. It demands internal rupture. You don't transcend by naming your patterns. You transform by burning through the ones you're still protecting. If that sentence felt personal, then you already know. Because you may have walked a version of that symbolic journey through the quiet Seer tetralogy on this channel. The 10 commandments, the 10 questions, the 10 trials, and the 10 revolts. If you have, you already understand the fire beneath those frames. If you haven't, that journey is still there, not for inspiration, but to expose the architecture you forgot was still intact. But this video is about what survives even that fire. The ego that doesn't resist awakening joins it. If you know Jung, you'll recognize it. The ego has learned your language, the persona has taken the microphone, and the self still waits behind the curtain. This isn't just a video about denial or repression. It's about something more precise and far more dangerous. The defense mechanisms you still use, not consciously, not maliciously, but structurally. You don't perform them. You are them right now, in your language, in your timing, in the way you stay legible while staying protected. We'll walk through all of it, from raw, primitive survival reactions to polished, high-functioning camouflage, from the defenses that scream to the ones that smile, from psychic collapse to strategic clarity. By the end, you won't just understand your patterns. You'll know exactly which version of you is still holding the microphone, because it's not always the one you think. You don't sabotage your progress. You preserve the architecture that kept you coherent when nothing else could. This isn't weakness, it's loyalty. And the most advanced form of defense? It doesn't hide your pain. It speaks your growth fluently. Defense mechanisms are not weaknesses. They are not signs of immaturity. They are the brilliant, invisible strategies your psyche built to maintain coherence under emotional threat. You didn't choose them. You formed them under pressure. Anna Freud first described them as the unconscious guardians of the ego, tools to keep anxiety and shame from flooding your system. Jung saw them as necessary illusions, temporary scaffolds meant to protect the ego, while the deeper self begins to stir beneath. Even now, the most self-aware people, especially the emotionally gifted, operate through layered defenses they've upgraded, not erased. The problem isn't that you have defenses. The problem is that you don't know which ones still govern your life. And if you can't see the scaffolding, you'll keep mistaking it for who you are. Let's break this down clearly. Defense mechanisms aren't random. They fall on a spectrum, a vertical system, and the level you're operating from tells you how close your psyche feels to threat. There are 3 levels. At the bottom, defenses that scream. In the middle, defenses that negotiate. At the top, defenses that perform. We start with the first tier, primitive defenses. These are survival mode responses. They don't care about logic or maturity. They exist to stop collapse. The most well-known? Denial, the refusal to register what's plainly in front of you. Not because you're foolish, but because seeing the full picture would emotionally destroy the version of you you've relied on. Then there's projection, a quiet evacuation. You assign your internal shame or rage to someone else, so you don't have to claim it. If you're convinced they hate me, look again. Often it means, I can't face the part of me I'm ashamed of. And here's another one, easily misunderstood, splitting. This isn't projection, it's fragmentation. You divide reality into all good or all bad, hero or enemy, because complexity feels overwhelming. It's safer to collapse the contradiction. But when even that becomes too much, you dissociate, you check out, you go still. Your body stays in the room, but your mind disconnects to avoid being overwhelmed. It's not weakness, it's evacuation. The psyche quietly exits the unbearable moment to protect the system from overload. And the danger? You might not even realize it happened until hours or days later when you feel unreal. And finally, idealization and devaluation. You make someone your savior when they validate your identity. But the moment they trigger your insecurity, they become a threat, so you discard them. These defenses are not just signs of trauma, they are signs your psyche doesn't yet trust itself to hold tension. Let's move up. The second tier is neurotic defenses. These are more refined, more normal. You see them in everyday adult life, but they're still built on avoidance. The first is displacement. You feel something too dangerous to express at the source, so you reroute it. You're angry at your boss, but you snap at your partner, not because they deserve it, but because your nervous system chose the easier target. Then there's reaction formation. You act out the opposite of what you feel. You become overly kind to someone you resent, or rigidly moral to suppress your own chaos. And then we hit rationalization. This one's slick. You explain your choices with clean logic, but underneath it's emotional protection. I left because the project lacked vision might actually mean, I felt invisible. Next, undoing. You violate a boundary, then overgive, not to repair, but to erase the guilt. Not healing, erasure, and finally repression, not forgetting. Deleting, your body remembers, but the context is gone. These are the defenses we often mistake for maturity, but they keep the ego in charge and the unconscious in exile. Jung would say the ego is orchestrating coherence, while the self is kept off stage. Now we reach the third tier, mature defenses. These don't deny pain, they transform it, but even here they can become performance. Sublimation is the alchemy of emotion. You turn rage into poetry, sorrow into action, instinct into contribution. Then there's humor. Not to deflect, but to release. It disarms the tension without hiding it. Anticipation. You process what's coming without obsession. You prepare without running. Suppression. You consciously pause expression. Not from fear, but because you're timing it for impact. And altruism, not to earn safety, but to give without internal transaction. These are signs that you're integrating, that the self is being allowed to speak. But even mature defenses can be masks, if you use them to avoid pain instead of move through it. So the real question isn't, which defense are you using? The question is, what part of yourself are you still protecting? Not violently, not loudly, but so elegantly you stop noticing. You don't lie because you're fake. You lie because you once built a version of yourself that could survive a hostile world. And when the new world arrives, when you awaken, when your values evolve, you forget to release the old self. So you defend it. You defend the oxygen mask that once saved your life. You defend the image that kept you emotionally legible. You defend the character that earned you belonging in a system that no longer exists. The truth is, you're not afraid of rejection. You're afraid of irrelevance. You're afraid of becoming incomprehensible, even to yourself. So under pressure, you re-perform the version of you that once worked. This is not a behavior problem, it's a structure problem. In Jungian language, you're caught between persona and self, the mask that still functions, in the truth that's ready to emerge. And the longer you perform the mask, the more the self waits in silence. If this activated something in you, don't perform reflection. Name the defense you recognize most, not for exposure, not for validation, but because naming collapses performance. Write it below, not to be seen, but to stop hiding and subscribe. Only if you're done optimizing your identity and ready to dismantle it. This is not a channel for self-improvement. It's a channel for confrontation, for surgical honesty, for the death of the persona that no longer fits, for the birth of something deeper. If you've studied Jung, you know this isn't about becoming better. It's about becoming whole. You don't need to destroy your defenses. You need to outgrow the identity they were built to protect. Because when the self becomes stable, defense becomes design. You stop explaining who you are. You speak, and the architecture is felt before the words are heard. You don't need to master every mechanism. Just name the one you've been loyal to the longest. The one you called you, not to fix it, but to finally stop performing coherence. Because once you see the system, once you recognize the mask that survived awakening, there is no going back. Only the question remains, will you keep rehearsing the role? Or will you let the self step forward without apology and without armor?